On the 22nd of December 1998, federal agents arrived at the Alaska Airlines heavy maintenance facility in Oakland, California, with subpoenas. They were there in response to a complaint filed by a senior aircraft mechanic at the facility, a man named John Leotine, who had spent the previous 15 months secretly recording his supervisors on a tape recorder he carried in his pocket. The recordings and the documents he had been quietly photocopying described a maintenance culture in which lubrication intervals had been extended without justification. End play measurements had been retaken until they fell within limits. Jackscrew replacements ordered by senior mechanics had been overruled on the next shift, and aircraft had been signed off and returned to service in conditions Leotine believed were unsafe. Among the aircraft on his list was a McDonnell Douglas MD-83, registration ending in 963 Alpha Sierra, on which, 2 years earlier, he had personally ordered a worn jackscrew replaced, and on which his order had been countermanded after he had gone home for the night. 13 months later, on the 31st of January 2000, the same aircraft would fall from 26,000 feet into the Pacific Ocean, roughly 2 7/10 miles north of Anacapa Island, California. All 88 people on board would die. The flight number was Alaska Airlines 261. The cause of the crash, the National Transportation Safety Board would eventually conclude, was almost exactly the failure mode John Leotine had been warning the federal authorities about for the previous 15 months. The component at the center of the disaster is called the horizontal stabilizer trim system, and it sits at the rear of every airliner of this family. The horizontal stabilizer is the small wing at the tail. Its angle relative to the airflow determines whether the aircraft's nose pitches up or down. And on this aircraft type, the angle is adjusted in flight by a single threaded shaft known as a jackscrew, which rotates through a fixed nut to drive the stabilizer up or down. The jackscrew was a piece of case-hardened steel, 22 inches long and 1.5 inches in diameter. The nut through which it turned was made of a softer copper alloy. Both components were designed to wear gradually over thousands of flight hours, and both required regular lubrication with a thick aviation grease to slow that wear to its predicted rate. Without lubrication, the soft alloy nut would erode against the harder steel screw at roughly 12 times the expected rate. Alaska Airlines, in the years leading up to 2000, had extended its lubrication interval for the jackscrew assembly 4 separate times, each extension approved by the Federal Aviation Administration on the basis of paperwork the airline itself had submitted. The original interval, in the late 1980s, had been 500 flight hours. By 1996, it had been stretched to 2,550 flight hours, an increase of more than 5 times. The end play check, the procedure by which mechanics measured how worn the jackscrew threads had become, had been extended in the same way. The two procedures, taken together, had drifted further and further apart from the schedule the aircraft's manufacturer had originally specified. In September of 1997, the aircraft that would become Flight 261 underwent its scheduled heavy maintenance at the Oakland facility. During the inspection, a senior mechanic measured the jackscrew end play and found it at the maximum allowable wear limit. He ordered the jackscrew assembly replaced. The next shift, working against a deadline to release the aircraft, repeated the measurement and found a result within limits. The replacement order was rescinded. The aircraft was returned to service with the same jackscrew assembly it had arrived with. The next scheduled overhaul of the component was 2.5 years away. In the 2.5 years that followed, the aircraft flew roughly 27,000 hours. The lubrication of the jackscrew in that period was performed once, in September of 1999, 4 months before the crash. The mechanic who carried out the work later told investigators he could not remember whether he had checked to see if grease was emerging from the top of the nut, which was. The standard verification that the lubrication had reached the threads. The procedure was supposed to take 4 hours. The mechanic's time card showed he had completed it in 1. When investigators later examined the recovered Acme nut, they found the grease passage plugged with a dried, clay-like residue, and the internal threads worn down to a thin, smooth surface. Approximately 90% of the thread thickness was already gone before the aircraft left Puerto Vallarta on the afternoon of the 31st. On the 31st of January 2000, the skies over the Pacific coast were calm. The weather was clear, and the McDonnell Douglas was being readied at Lic Gustavo Diaz Ordaz International Airport in Puerto Vallarta for a scheduled flight to Seattle, with an intermediate stop at San Francisco. 83 passengers and 5 crew boarded the aircraft in the early afternoon local time. In the cockpit sat Captain Ted Thompson, 53 years old, with 17,750 flight hours behind him, and First Officer Bill Tansky, 57 years old, with around 8,000 of his own. Both pilots had flown for Alaska Airlines for the better part of 2 decades, and both had been military aviators before joining the airline. 3 Seattle-based cabin attendants completed the crew. Pushback occurred shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Pacific time, and the aircraft climbed out over the Pacific Ocean, turned northwest, and began its cruise toward the California coastline. Climbing through 23,400 feet, the autopilot detected something unusual about the horizontal stabilizer. The component was not responding to its trim commands. The Acme nut threads, already worn beyond their design limits, had stopped sliding cleanly along the jackscrew and had begun to bind against the residue and the metal of the screw itself. A warning light appeared in the cockpit. The pilots, working through the procedure for a jammed stabilizer trim system, disengaged the autopilot and took manual control of the aircraft. To hold the nose level against the slight nose-down bias the stabilizer was now exerting, they had to pull back on the control columns with roughly 50 pounds of force. They climbed through the next several thousand feet manually, reached their cruise altitude of 31,000 feet, and settled into a flight regime in which one of them, at all times, had to be physically holding the aircraft level. For the next 2 hours, they tried to free the stabilizer. They tried the primary trim switches on the control yokes, the longitudinal trim handles in the center pedestal, and the 2 systems operating simultaneously. They switched to the alternate trim motor. They checked the circuit breakers. The stabilizer remained jammed at approximately 0.4 of a degree nose down. They re-engaged the autopilot, and the problem persisted. They contacted Alaska Airlines maintenance control in Seattle and described what they were experiencing, and the maintenance controller offered a series of troubleshooting steps. None of them worked. Captain Thompson then raised the question of diverting. The maintenance controller suggested San Francisco. Thompson preferred Los Angeles. lower terrain on the approach, dry runways, lighter winds, better conditions in which to attempt a landing with a partially compromised flight control system. The maintenance controller's response, on the recorded line, indicated that operational scheduling at Los Angeles might be affected by the diversion. Thompson, audibly frustrated, made clear that the choice of airport would be based on the safety of the landing rather than the convenience of the airline's operation. The diversion to Los Angeles was approved. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, with the aircraft holding its altitude over the open Pacific and the pilots still working the controls manually, the captain made a decision that, in retrospect, marked the beginning of the end of the flight. He disengaged the autopilot one more time, intending to try the trim system in manual control. A clunk was audible on the cockpit voice recording, then 2 faint thumps. The Acme nut threads, already worn to a fraction of their original thickness, had finally sheared against the jackscrew. The screw, no longer held by the nut, drove the stabilizer hard nose down. The aircraft pitched over and entered a steep dive. From the cabin, the dive was the first indication anything was wrong. Passengers were thrown forward against their seatbelts. Unsecured items lifted off the floor and struck the ceiling of the cabin. Through the windows, the surface of the Pacific filled the view ahead of the aircraft. The first officer's voice, captured by air traffic control, reported the situation in a tone that registered as deliberate rather than panicked. The aircraft had passed through 26,000 feet descending. The vertical speed indicator was reading more than 7,000 feet per minute. The first officer corrected himself. They were not in a dive, exactly, but they had lost vertical control of the aircraft. Together, the 2 pilots pulled back on the control columns with all the force they could exert. The figures recovered from the flight data recorder later indicated combined column forces approaching 140 pounds. They deployed the speed brakes to slow the aircraft. 80 seconds after the initial pitchover, with the aircraft passing through 24,000 feet, they managed to arrest the descent and level the wings. The dive had cost them roughly 7,000 feet. The aircraft was barely controllable, but it was, for the moment, still flying. Captain Thompson requested a block altitude from air traffic control, permission to operate between 20,000 and 25,000 feet without separation conflicts, and explained that the crew would be troubleshooting the trim issue further. He contacted maintenance control again and reported that the stabilizer had now moved to a full nose-down position. The mechanic on the other end of the radio acknowledged the report and offered no new solution. The flight was, in every operational sense, alone. Captain Thompson then made an announcement to the cabin. He told the passengers that the aircraft had experienced flight control difficulties and that the crew had elected to divert to Los Angeles. He told them the flight crew was doing everything possible to ensure a safe landing. His voice on the cabin address system was calm. The passengers, frightened, were quiet. As the aircraft neared the California coastline, the crew began to plan their approach into Los Angeles International Airport. They needed to slow the aircraft, and to do so, they would need to extend the wing's high-lift devices. The captain instructed the first officer to extend the leading-edge slats. The aircraft remained stable. He then called for 11 degrees of flap. The aircraft continued to hold steady. He then asked the first officer to retract both, intending to make one further attempt to free the stabilizer using the trim controls. The retraction was the final aerodynamic load the assembly could absorb. With the flaps and slats moving and the airflow over the tail changing rapidly, the upper mechanical stops of the jackscrew gave way. The stripped Acme nut, which had been holding the stabilizer at its current angle, through nothing more than the residual friction of its worn surfaces, released. The stabilizer rotated freely to its mechanical limit. The aircraft pitched violently nose down and entered a second, far steeper dive. What followed is recorded in the final minute of the cockpit voice recording. The captain attempted to roll the aircraft inverted, working from a logic familiar to military test pilots. With the stabilizer locked in a nose-down position, flipping the aircraft over would convert that nose-down command into a nose-up command relative to the ground. For a brief moment, it worked. The aircraft, inverted at high speed over the Pacific, began to pitch upward and arrest the dive. But the airframe was not designed for sustained inverted flight. The engines, fuel system, and flight controls were not certified for the loads being placed on them, and the aerodynamic forces were exceeding the design limits of the tail surfaces. The pilots attempted to roll the aircraft back upright. The control surfaces no longer responded as they should. The engines lost thrust. The aircraft, inverted, descending at more than 200 miles per hour, fell the remaining distance to the Pacific Ocean. The first officer keyed his microphone to send a mayday and did not get the words out. At approximately 21 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, the McDonnell Douglas struck the water roughly 2 7/10 miles north of Anacapa Island, off the coast of Southern California. The aircraft was destroyed on impact. All 88 people on board were killed. Pilots in nearby aircraft, who had been watching the dive on their own radar displays, reported what they had seen to air traffic control within seconds. Search and rescue assets were on the water within the hour. The wreckage was scattered across a debris field on the ocean floor, in water that was, in places, more than 600 feet deep. Over the following weeks, side-scan sonar and remotely operated vehicles recovered roughly 85% of the fuselage, both engines, the flight data recorder, and the cockpit voice recorder. The horizontal stabilizer was recovered 9 days after the crash. The Acme nut, when it was found, was still attached to the vertical fin in its original mounting, but the jackscrew was no longer inside it. Wrapped around the screw, in a coiled spring shape resembling a child's toy, was a thin strip of bronze. It was what remained of the threads. The investigation that followed was one of the most thorough in the history of the safety board. Metallurgists examined the wear patterns on the nut. Grease specialists ran tests to determine whether the lubricant itself had failed. Maintenance investigators traced every signature in the aircraft's records back through years of overhauls. John Leotine, the mechanic who had ordered the jackscrew replaced in 1997 and who had spent the following months recording his supervisors, gave hours of testimony. The federal raid on Oakland in December of 1998 had not produced an emergency directive that grounded the aircraft. The investigation had still been ongoing on the day the airframe fell into the Pacific. The Safety Board's final report, published nearly 3 years after the crash, identified the cause as the in-flight failure of the Acme nut threads. A failure produced, in turn, by Alaska Airlines' inadequate lubrication of the jackscrew assembly, by its extension of the lubrication and end-play check intervals beyond the limits the manufacturer had originally specified, and by the Federal Aviation Administration's approval of those extensions without adequate analysis. A senior safety board member, in his own statement attached to the report, used a phrase that became the most quoted line of the entire investigation. He called it a maintenance accident, and he said that had any of the managers, mechanics, inspectors, Supervisors, or aviation regulators whose job it was to protect this mechanism, done their job conscientiously, the accident could not have happened. Captain Thompson and First Officer Tansky were posthumously awarded the Airline Pilots Association's Gold Medal for heroism. The flight data recorder showed that in the final 2 minutes of the flight, they had attempted maneuvers that were not in any flight manual, executed at the edges of an airframe whose tail had become structurally unsound. The inverted flight, in particular, improvised, unprecedented, executed without warning or preparation, was studied by test pilots and flight instructors in the years that followed as an example of professional response to an unsurvivable situation. A memorial was unveiled at Port Hueneme on the California coast not far from the wreckage site. It takes the form of a 20-foot sundial. At 22 minutes past 4 o'clock every afternoon, on the 31st of January, the shadow falls across a bronze plaque bearing the names of the 88 people on board. The time is the minute after impact. The names are listed alphabetically, with no distinction between the pilots, the cabin crew, and the passengers, because the safety board had concluded that they had all died of the same cause: a thread that had not been greased, by a mechanic who had not been given enough time, in a hangar that had not been properly overseen, on an aircraft that had not been properly maintained, by an airline that had been quietly cutting corners on safety for years.